Hello and welcome back to Well That Aged Well. And in the first episode of 2025, we will talk about the samurai and the history of the samurai culture. I want to begin, of course, with what was it about the samurais for you that made you so fascinated by them, and what made it what were that? I mean, it's kind of obvious, but because they're really awesome. But what was the real attraction for you to begin to study the samurai?
Well, when I was in junior high, I read a book about the samurai, and it talked about how they were great fighters and willing to die for a lord. And actually, at the time, I thought this can't be true. And so
Mm.
I spent a lot of time, then studying Japanese. And probably the biggest inspiration for me was actually when I read, it was actually called a battle report. It dates from the 14th century. And when these warriors were fighting, they actually submitted were like insurance claims, and they would list all their damages and wounds, and you had someone that would inspect it and write deep and shallow and all that. So this kind of bureaucratic nature of this and how they would write down their accounts, that's what I really found fascinating about them.
Now, I want to begin in order to understand why the samurai formed. I want to begin by talking a little bit about Japan before this formation of samurai in order to understand how they came to existence and how. So I want to have a little understanding of how Japan was in the age before the samurai.
Sure. No, thank you. So the I'd say, where I would begin is that Japan in the roughly the 7th and 8th century became it was created. It became an empire. You have an emperor, and it's a very powerful bureaucratic state. And where they would have a census, they would divide land up evenly, they would build roads, and so on. And what's interesting is right around the year 745, they discovered a lot of gold in the north. And when they did that, there was the north was Japan has four islands now. The main island is called Honshu, and the northern bit of Honshu was not controlled by the state. And so what there was like a 40-year war with they're called the Emishi, the people of the north, where the state tried to control that region because it was incredibly rich in gold. They would probably extract close to 200 pounds of gold a year from the year 745 onward. Um, and this campaign lasted for 40 years. It didn't go so well until finally, what you had is there's an emperor called Kamu, and he would dispatch generals to the north, and they were known as the pacification general, and another one was known as the Seitai Shogun, which was the barbarian subduing general. And the person who was appointed to this was named Sakunoe Tamanomaru, and he was successful in basically quelling the North. And then he came back to Kyoto, but in northern Japan, you actually have what's called a sixth district army. It was a standing army that protected the North for a long time, and that is one of the most important things because you have this standing army, and then we see in later centuries people are trying to gain control of that army, and I think that influences the martial quality of this Japan and so on in this earlier time.
Where Japan united as we see it is today, back in the 7th, 6th century, where several principalities and some mini countries, so to speak, or petty kingdoms divided. How was the state of Japan back then?
This early state was an extremely powerful state where they had divided it up. They built roads, they had districts, they appointed governors, and in fact, you had I say it's a very centralized, powerful administrative state that existed, arguably as powerful as anything until the 19th century. So there was not a whole lot of autonomy. You did have conscription. That was one of the major taxes, where people would have to be in the army like per village, one person from the age of 15 to 60. But this became unwieldy, so that's where the 792 they abolished conscription and instead had this standing army in the north, and otherwise they would just have a small group of warriors. But no, it was a very powerful state, and gradually it decentralizes. But that process really only became really important about the 14th century. So yeah, it's a very remarkably you know unified state in this earlier time.
So let's begin with the origins of the samurai and how did it became into existence? Were they called samurais from the very start, or was that a term that been given to them later by later rulers or historians?
So the word samurai, it's sort of, it comes from a verb which means to serve, and it's a situational term. So that, for example, in this earlier period, if someone with martial prowess had come in and asked to a lord, this would be a noble, a court official, they might want to serve them and be on their behalf. That word would come into play. But it's not a status. It's not a class term at all. And in fact, these early warriors preferred a variety of other terms. I mean, I would say the one that gets formalized earliest, that's probably most important, is from the 11th to 12th century onward. There's a term called gokeni, which means householder, and this idea that a true warrior has a house. And within that house, they have their dependent followers, and these people are known as samurai. So what's interesting is that for a high-ranking warrior, the crucial component of their identity was that they would have land. Um, and so those that are called samurai really didn't have land, and they didn't have this autonomy. So if we were to go back in time and see these more prominent warriors on horseback and all that, and call them a samurai, they would probably get really upset and try to shoot us. And so what happens is, and I could talk about this in more length, is
Oh,
that
please do.
land holdings are the hallmark of a warrior identity, particularly from the 12th century through the 16th century. And that finally it and the but the problem with landholding is that these it's it's a finite resource, so that if warriors are fighting and they have to pay for the expenses of war just based on their own lands, it's very difficult to continue. So after a lot, centuries of warfare, what you see is a lot of these warriors lose their autonomy. And the key point, I would say, is that it's really not until the 1590s that there's this prominent warlord named Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and he transforms Japanese society. And one of the things he does is he believes that land rights are the basis of disorder. So he forces everyone with lands to have a choice. They can either keep their lands and then be known as commoners or peasants, or they could keep their swords, but they have to relinquish rights to the land, and they get a revenue, and they have to live near a lord. And when that happens, that's when you start seeing the whole order is called a samurai, because they have to serve their lord. They don't have their own lands. They have to live near a lord in a castle town. And so I'd say from the 1590s onward, then that's when you start seeing a samurai order, which becomes an urban sort of order, and Japan becomes urbanized. It's totally different from what happened before. So the samurai as a larger social category is relatively late. 1590s to 1870s is that's the only time period I'd say that exists.
Now, it's my understanding that some of the early samurai, and I don't remember where I read this or if this is right at all, but most early samurai were not these elite warriors. As you said, they were mostly poor peasants who took up arms, and they were kind of looked down upon in early days of their existence. Is that true, or is that something
Well,
that?
I would actually say that sort of, so I talked first about how you have this standing army and
Yeah.
the situation in the north, and you still have a powerful court, and these courtiers need warriors, and actually these courtiers would have a martial component to their actions, and so they would want someone to be skilled, to help them out. And the big change, I would say, is that once Japan went away from conscription in the 8th century, to smaller forces, these people had to be on horseback, so they had to actually be quite skilled. And so I would say that they weren't really. I mean, if they're looked down upon, it's because they kill. And in the Buddhist context, that gives you it's a demerit to be killing things. You see, but it's not. I don't see them as being really looked down upon as much. But they were thought to be the inferiors of courtiers. And what happens over time is that as they gain more power, they emulate the court, and then they end up getting more court ranks. And I'd say, like, again, 14th century, in particular, they act like courtiers, or they try to out courtier courtiers. And so there's this appeal of the court is something that I think is often lost in these early narratives. But if you look at like early portraits of some of the famous warriors, you'll see they're not in armor; they're wearing court robes. And it's really not until 15th, 16th century we see like the portraits of them wearing armor from the time, because always military authority was thought to be delegated from the court. So these people, they cherish court offices and their ties to the court like that. And that's also why they strove to be literate. They strove to be cultured, and there's this idea that to be a warrior, you had to be, able to write, and you had to be able to, a practitioner of the bow. And so they would even, and they would actually have in their quiver, they'd have like a brush and documents, and they would write these records and so on. So that's an interesting aspect, is you have very high literacy levels among these people, particularly 13th century onward.
I don't know if this is a comparison you can comment on, even if it's a fair comparison, but I kind of tend to see the samurai kind of in the way that the janissaries of the Ottomans were, minus that they were slave soldiers, of course, but they would become these elite warriors, and they and have high influence in court, as did the janissaries. So is it fair to kind of compare them to the janissaries in a way, again, minus the fact that they were slave soldiers like the janissaries were?
I would say that the slave component is not there at all. And so what the key thing about these earlier warriors is that, once we see, for example, in this, from the 10th century onward, what you have is Japan starts to decentralize. So what they do is they have a provincial governor, who's the person who collects taxes and does it. And this person needs to rely on his deputies, and they're called Zaicho Kanju, these are local officials. And that's what the warriors essentially are. So they are actually, I would say, they're not the governor of a province, but they would be high-ranking people within that province. And then later on, they get lands. So I would say the janissary thing does not fit, because they are, I'd say, for the period when they're fighting, they are actually the local elites of society. The numbers aren't great. You might be talking 90 to 100 per province, maybe 200, a few households like that. But I would say that no, they're not slaves or that of a lower status at all.
So if you wanted to become a samurai, what did it take, and what was there a certain class like nobility that could become samurai, or was it could anyone become samurai at least in the early stage? What was the requirements to become a samurai?
Often the requirement is like people have to be. I mean, again, they didn't call themselves samurai; they call
Yeah,
themselves local
I
officials.
mean, I'm
Okay,
using this term for
okay,
simplifications, of
um,
course.
okay, and so what they would it would be relatively easy for a member of the court to become a warrior. And there are some cases where you have like a scribe. They were good at writing documents, and they go down to the provinces, and then they get some land, and then they do training, and they become warriors. So you might have heard there's like a famous family called the Uesugi family. They were originally court scribes, and so that transition is pretty easy, actually, I would say. And then the only other thing I
But
would say.
like peasants do not become samurai or
No,
warriors.
well, the peasants. One thing is Japan is that the society is heavily militarized. So you have what are known as commoners, but it's a highly stratified society. So that what happens is if one wants to rise up, you see this in times of warfare. If you have a lower status and are good at fighting, you might be able to become a follower of a warrior who then might give you more lands and all that. But it's a longer process. But the issue is that these earlier warriors, and this is, I'd say, again, from the 800s to the 15th century, they ride on horseback and they're archers. And it's a longbow. Requires a lot of training, and so it's often they need to really be practicing this from a very young age. So that's where the household is so important. It's like a warrior household that's training, and they train their children, and actually sons and daughters will be trained. And so that's the one thing I think is interesting, is that that the women would also fight. And if it's a case where it's dominant, on horseback with bows and arrows, the women don't have a disadvantage at all. And so that's another side of this.
So I know we want to talk about this a little bit later, but I'm bringing up now, and I want to talk a little bit just again later on when we establish that these are samurai. What was the military strength and this training like, and military discipline to become? And what for when you first joined the samurai? What were the training like and this military discipline?
Well, we know that. that in these households they would, learn how to ride horses. They would also practice archery, other things, other shock weapons. They would have swords and so on, but those would be more used for personal defense in a lot of ways. And so, in terms of how are they organized, so they would be skilled in battle. They would be skilled at fighting, and then when we underestimate the importance of the bow, and that I've seen these Japanese longbows that they could shoot an arrow through a Teflon plate. You know what I mean? And so they are quite powerful, and so they're tactically skilled, but there is an almost congenital what lack of interest in following orders. And so this is one thing that's quite interesting. You see this in the early campaigns where these warriors, when they're fighting, they want to get rewards or compensation for the service. And you can read about, there's this one remarkable account of a warrior named Takizaki Suenaga who fought against the Mongols, and they would actually say when the Mongols are coming, stand here and wait and then attack. And he just ignored the command and he just went and attacked. And then he said, look, I was first in battle. You wrote my name on the document first. I should get rewards. And often when warriors would do something, like if they killed an enemy, they needed proof of their service, so they would like cut off the head or take a piece of armor, and as soon as they had that success, they would leave the battlefield. So there is what I call command authority is extremely weak, and these armies are not very cohesive and they're not very effective, and these people just do not follow orders much at all. And that's sort of that trend for them to actually follow an order and all that is something that really happens more 15th, 16th century when you actually have a complete transformation of tactics. And I'd be happy to talk about that
Yeah,
if you're interested.
we will talk about that later, of course. But I want to ask you, when you talked about there was kind of military hierarchy in Japan, medieval Japan, in military wise. But was there also within and we will talk about the Shogun later, of course. But within the samurai order, was there also ranking and military hierarchy there as well? Like you had the lower samurai and in generals, etc. on top.
The in pre 14th century, I would say it's not very strong. You actually have more illustrious houses. But again, the people that are more illustrious tend to have court rank and court offices. As for these warriors, they tend to, what they want to do is get their own lands. And as soon as they had something, they saw themselves as being the equals to others. And they would do things like whoever had a few acres of land, then they would take this as theirs, and they would manage it. And they would even, like, siblings would change their name to emphasize the fact that they are autonomous. So they really emphasize this sort of equality, that any of these Gokenin or householders would be equal in a lot of ways. So it's but within the house, it's extremely hierarchy. So those that don't have lands were thought they would have to follow a lord. You see, so and so that's probably one of the changes you see. So it's like if you look at the different statuses, what you have are, I'd say, the highest in the provinces would be those householders, warriors that have certain lands. Then within their household, they would have younger warriors or samurai who would follow them. Then you might have more commoners, peasants who would have some weapons but just be more autonomous. And then you might have some people that would be more at the level of the unfree and slaves, and they would also have weapons. But that's kind of how the society would work. But above these householders, these tended to be fairly ephemeral appointments. The idea of being a general or a protector or something like that is something that wouldn't last very long, and so these warriors often wouldn't feel like following them, and that doesn't really change until later.
Was it like in where we see European societies in this time? Was the title of general, was that the high mostly for the elite warriors? That you like, if you rose through the ranks, could you become a general eventually? If you rose from the bottom and then by experience gain the title of general? Or was it mostly the elites in Japanese society?
In this case, what I'd say is that all the crucial points of a general would come from the court. So it'd be someone who was specifically appointed by the court. So this is early, and so all the major shogunal positions or all that are ones that the court would make this appointment. It was usually thought to be something temporary. As we go to later centuries, you have a new office from the 1190s, basically onward, called a shugo, which is a protector. And those people were thought to provide order and to organize these householders. But again, they did not have a lot of prestige, and it wasn't really until about the mid 14th century when a shugo was given the ability to tax half of a province for provisions that suddenly that position becomes much more powerful. And then what we see is from the 1350s to around 1600 is the people that have this position are using their new wealth to break down the autonomy of these warriors. And it kind of culminates in that process that I was talking about before, where all the warriors have to give up their lands. So that's sort of the trajectory, as it were.
Now, I want to talk a little bit, we mentioned this earlier a little bit, but let's talk about the Emperor Kamu and how he created the title of Shogun, because that's arguably, I think, one of the more famous titles that are associated with samurai. But was it strictly to samurai relations that Shogun, the title of Shogun, were created, or how did this become connected to the samurais?
Well, it's so remember I mentioned earlier how there was a powerful state that created this army in them, right? So when Kamu created, what
Excuse-
happened was is that he created a position um, to to help pacify the North. And there are multiple shogun titles. There's one called a pacification general, there's one called a barbarian subduing general, but they're all linked to that campaign of Japan to gain control over the far north and the gold producing regions. Now, centuries later, what you had is there was a governor who tried to gain control of this army, and he was of the Minamoto lineage. And make a long story short, it didn't work. But then you start seeing all these myths talking about how these warriors are linked to this title of shogun. And I'd say that it really it becomes uh, 13th century there. I mean, there's actually in the 1180s there was one warrior named Yoritomo who created supposedly the first shogunate. He was given the title of shogun, and he actually conquered the north. And he did that to show he had this power. But as soon as he conquered the north, he got rid of the title of shogun. He gave it to his son, and he adopted a higher court rank, and a higher court title. And what's also interesting is that for the first shogunate, that it was actually, after he and his sons died out, you actually had Fuji nobles, and then you actually had imperial princes who were the shogun for a long time. So it's not until the 14th century you see the rise of a new family called the Ashikaga, and they are the ones that glorify. They said, we are the Minamoto lineage. We've had this right to rule because of our name. And they start to kind of glorify the title of shogun as we know it. So it's a legacy of a later time, is what I'd say. And then from then on, this idea of the shogun becomes, it's an important position. But at certain points, other people will adopt other titles, and it's not until then there's the third great shogunate called the Tokugawa shogunate, and they're the ones that also make a big deal about this position. So it fluctuates. That's what I would say.
And another thing, of course, that is famously associated with the samurai is the famous katana sword. And let's talk a little bit about how the Emperor Katana and, of course, the. Sorry, I'm just trying to look at the name here. I think the Masahuma. Sorry if I say the name wrong, but let's talk about the introduction of the katana and how, again, how it became associated with samurai. Was it always kind of the samurai that was it exclusive to the samurai, or were other warriors as well wielding the katana
Well,
sword?
lots of people had swords. I mean, so what's interesting is actually it was the bow and the arrow which was thought to be the defining weapon for the warrior, not the idea of the sword as being the soul of the samurai or something that we start seeing in the 17th century onwards. It was not the dominant weapon for them. Swords were important. They you could see changes in their create. Sometimes where the sword they were used to be straight swords, and they gradually become curved, and that's due to changes in the tempering process. You see what I
So,
mean? And
so,
so
so if swords were that common, were pitched battles really a thing in
you
medieval
would.
war
I mean,
Japan?
so what happens is that it's very rare for people to engage in hand-to-hand combat on the battlefield. And so often what we have at this earlier time is that the warriors are on horseback, they're shooting with they're shooting each other with arrows. The armor's geared for that. It's designed for that. And so these warriors would have their swords at their bedside in case someone attacks them at night or something. But it's relatively rare to actually have people stabbing. Now it can happen, and in a pitched battle, you see people are fighting. But I found when we could identify like the percentage of wounds with all these documents, it's pretty rare. It's probably about 10% of all wounds are caused by swords, whereas the vast majority are caused by bows. And it's just the projectile. If you just think about it, people are going to shoot at each other. They're not going to come right next to the enemy unless they really have to. And then what changes is that I'd say that and if people are going to come to the enemy, they like having big swords. So the irony is that the time when swords are most often used is the 14th century, where it's not quite the katana that we imagine, but it's called an odachi, which is a sword that can have a blade between 5 to 7 feet long. And so you'd have like one person just holding this, and no one would come near them. And so it could break the legs of a horse, and they could stab people and do what they wanted with that. And that's sort of a peculiar weapon to the 14th century. What later happens in the 15th century is actually these new generals, that gain more power. They're able to create like a standing army, and when they create a standing army, they have all these people can train. And when they train, they realize that better than having scattered people with big swords, the pike is a better weapon. And so that's where we see really 1460s, the pike becomes the dominant handheld weapon. And then these pike go from being like, say, 6 feet in length to 20 feet in length. You see what I mean? And so then you have these infantry formations where you have people holding pikes, or you also will still have people that are fighting, with bows or later on guns like that. And so that's probably the major change. And then these armies get way bigger after the course of the 15th and 16th century, where they will have tens of thousands of people in them at later time.
Now we will get to the Mongol invasion in a second, but I want to touch a little bit before, because of course the nearest peninsula to Japan is Korea. And what was the relation between Korea and Japan like? And did Japan send warriors into Korea to fight on the mainland, or was there really that you see these two countries collide before the Mongol invasion?
Well, I mean, um, if you go back far enough in time in the 600s, Korea was actually made of three different kingdoms, and they were fighting. And one of the kingdoms, called Pekche, was very close to this Yamato state. And when it collapsed, its crown prince went there, and so that's where Japan tried to resurrect the state and failed. After that, but that's very early, and after that time, you don't see a lot of major conflict. You don't see Japan projecting force into Korea. You do see some skirmishes on the seas in the 15th century. You also see that one of the Korean kingdoms, when it was attacked by the Mongols, asked Japan for help, but they just didn't have the ability to really come in. Now, then we also have the invasions in the 1590s, and that's another thing entirely. That is a full scale invasion with large numbers of troops, and this was done by Hideyoshi, and that's really at the. But that's a very different kind of
Now we
point of
have
view.
to, of course, talk about the Mongol invasion, because that is a big part of Japanese history and Mongol history as well. Because as we discussed in our episode about Kublai Khan with Boris Rosabi, we talked about how this would kind of shatter the idea of Mongol invisibility, because obviously they would lose the battle. And let's talk a little bit about how the samurais would, of course, be involved in the Mongol, and of course the famous game Ghost of Tsushima, which we will talk about at the end of the episode. We'll talk about mm, samurai in popular media today. But let's talk a little bit about how the samurai's role in the Mongol invasion and help defeating the Mongols as well, and what made the Mongols fail the invasion of Japan.
Well, that's so. One thing is that as the Mongols are expanding, I mean, I think if you see this in Marco Polo and you see this when they actually attacked Tsushima, they had an idea that Japan is full of precious metal. So they talked about Japan as the land of gold, Jipangu, and also when they invaded Tsushima, the first thing they landed right where close where a silver mine was located. The mine was defunct, but you see that. So that's the Mongol kind of goal, and they were probably surprised of how strongly these people fought. So I went to Tsushima, and there was one of the deputies, that was there, like the local warriors. And they fought so severely. It's like they had little mounds. It's like, okay, here's where his sword is found. Here's where his head was. Here's where his arm was. And so you get this idea that they were really fighting, very, very, very strongly. But they were completely actually outclassed by the Mongols. So that the Mongols. They did actually, in some of their accounts, feel that the Japanese were skilled with their longbows, but they were able to land on the coast of northern Kyushu where there's a good harbor. They burned the whole thing, and then after the 1274 invasion, they made their way back. The accounts do say that one of the generals was shot in the face, and what I find interesting is that actually we know from the Japanese accounts, the Mongol accounts, they named the same name because Japanese figures would actually write their name on the arrows, like "Hello, you've been shot by so and so," and so they could read that. So that's like the first stage of it, and then I'd say that what's interesting is that the Mongols, then what do? Well, they created what was called the Bureau for the Subjugation of Japan, and they used that organization to sort of establish a far stronger control over Korea. Um, and then they also conquered the Song dynasty. So after the 1274 invasion, I think one thing that they were successful is that they were really worried about a Southern Song Korean Japanese alliance, and that didn't happen because they destroyed the states. And then the next stage is that while that was happening within Japan, and I've kind of emphasized this bureaucratic side of things, is that what we have, the Japanese is called the Kamakura regime. Its first warrior government was actually dispatched a lot of these warriors. They said if you have any lands in the west, you have to go to the west, and they forced everyone to build walls next to the harbors like this. And the walls are set about 30 feet back from the harbor, and they're only about 3-4 feet high. And you actually had then ongoing guard duty from that time. And so what seems to have been really interesting is that the Mongols, like when they came back, they weren't expecting that this state would be able to build defensive walls around all their major harbors and man them. And when they did that, they could not really land at the same places they did before. So then they had to sail around. Now they still conquered the islands, so that Tsushima, that it was defeated both times. Another island called Iki, they didn't have the population to resist. But then the Mongol forces could not really land, and so for 6 weeks they're sort of off at the seas trying to find a place to basically establish a foothold. And I do think that the Mongols always expected that there would be like a major defection, and that just didn't happen. You see what I mean? There was just this fairly strong resistance to them until after 6 weeks. That's when you had the typhoon did hit, and what's interesting is whoever's in charge of this fleet didn't know, because if you're a good naval commander, if you're going to see a hurricane or something coming, you take the fleet out to sea where you can weather it easily. But instead, they went to a harbor at a place called Takashima, and then the whole thing sank. But what sank is interesting is it was the Song Navy. So they had captured the Song Navy, and so it still had the Song naval markings on it. They didn't even bother to change that, and so that's really, I'd say, why they failed was more of, I'd say, almost the institutional and organizational prowess on the Japanese side as opposed to anything else. But within Japan, I mean, a lot of courtiers and other people felt that it was the storm was decisive, and that the warriors were just sort of agents of divine will in some ways, but the warriors didn't really dispute that.
Now I want to talk a little bit about the Emperor Toyot. Sorry if I say his name wrong again. I'm not familiar with Japanese names, so do forgive me. But Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and how he forbade civilians and only allowed the samurais to carry weapons. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that's what how it, or at least military command to carry weapon, and how this forbade this, how civilians cannot carry weapons anymore. What did this do to the Japanese society?
and I kind of talked about this a little bit before, where I mentioned that, I mean, the larger trend of what's happening 15th, 16th centuries, you've seen the rise of autonomous power, you've seen the rise of warriors who are, leaders who are able to sort of amass large armies. And one thing that happens with these armies is that they get so large that they need to find new ways to sort of basically feed themselves. And so that's where Hideyoshi is very good at doing a lot of surveys and actually making like rice the currency to feed the armies. The other thing that he did was he felt that that of the rulers of Japan should monopolize coercive force. So they're the only ones that should engage in this violence. So what he tried to do is to break down the autonomy of all these warriors. And that's why, remember before I said he gave them a choice of, you have to either have lands and no weapons, but in fact they still would. Or you could be a samurai. They call it a samurai at this time. It has a legal meaning. You can have these weapons, you get a stipend. And so this is the time when then this idea of the katana is a marker of a samurai status, which means that you don't have lands, but you have to live in a city, and you're guaranteed a stipend of income. And then those that don't that still keep the lands were thought to be peasants or commoners. Now, in the peripheries, some areas you do see that these are powerful people that would say, "Oh, I'm a commoner," but then they'd still have all kinds of weapons. You know what I mean? So it wasn't perfect. So that's what the other trend, what Hideyoshi would try to do is he would say, "Okay, we'll divide this up," but then he would then take the whole unit, like the whole lord, and say, "I'm moving you somewhere else." So when that happens, the ties to the land had to be forcibly broken. And so that's when you really see that the samurai are an urban thing, and they don't really know the people around them. And yet Hideyoshi didn't do that all throughout Japan. So the areas that they didn't do that, those lords were way more powerful because they still kind of had these partial warriors, you know what I mean? That they were peasants, but they were still armed. And so that's even as you go through and look at like what happens in Japan, in the 19th century, the various domains which are the most powerful actors are the ones where this movement never happened. Now, again, and I'd say that really it's after Hideyoshi, this idea of that the sword is so important, that the samurai is linked to the sword, and all of that. Then the ideals of, well, why do swords matter? What is the role of the warrior? And that's where all these things come in, precisely when they're not fighting and they have time on their hands.
How were the Japanese viewed at this? Sorry, not the Japanese, but the samurai. How were the samurai viewed at this time in history? Were they kind of like these elite heroes of society at this point, or did they ever become kind of like the heroes of the military in Japanese popular culture in
For
that
which
time?
time? Oh, I mean, for which time period? Sorry.
In the time of Hideyoshi.
Well, I mean, I'd say, um, yeah, they start, you start seeing them become there are war tales, there are popular works of literature that come in, 13th century onward. And more often than not, I think that the warrior is almost of a tragic figure. And so this idea that they're, I think there's, if anything, I'd say a lot of the war tales emphasize those that, they were magnificent, but then they were defeated, and they talk about then the evanescence of all life and power and all these other things. And so, but yeah, you do see, glorifications of these figures. Some are even deified as gods, and they do become like the dominant cultural figures, I'd say, really from 14th century onward.
No, I want to know. I'm jumping a little bit here, but I want to talk about the European arrival into Japanese society, and of course, with it, Christianity
Hmm.
arrives into. And we do see that there are some, though it of course will be forbidden as a religion later on. We do see some Christian samurais as well in how that convert into Christianity. And but it's my understanding that the Japanese people find it weird when when the Europeans arrived, how they preach about a bishop, sorry, a pope that was the all powerful ruler, but they seem so far away and kind of irrelevant to the Japanese as well. So they found it a bit I'm not gonna say a bit ludicrous in a way, how and a bit hypocrisy as well of Christianity as a religion. So that's actually a little bit of how Christianity were viewed and the arrival of the Europeans. And of course, at the 13 is gunpowder being introduced to Japan.
So, yeah, that's a thank you. No, I mean it's a big question. I mean, with the first arrival of the European, and it's important to realize that we're basically talking the Spanish, the Portuguese are the first ones to come in, and then the Spanish, and the Portuguese come from India because they were expanding, through the Cape of Good Hope to India, to Southeast China, and then their way up the coast. And they arrive in Japan, late 1540s, of the 1550s. So we have some interesting early accounts, and it actually within Japan there was no knowledge of Europe, there was no knowledge of race, there was no sense. So what the earliest Japanese documents refer to these Christians, they didn't know what a Christian was. They actually thought they were a reformist Buddhist sect from India. And so their accounts are saying, "Wow, we thought Buddhism had died out in India, but it looks like it's rebounded." And Francis Xavier came in and he said, "Oh, you should work," and he didn't have a good word for God, and so they used the word Dainichi, which is Vairochana, which is the cosmic Buddha. So you had these people coming from India worshiping the Buddha, so they were thought to be a reformist Buddhist sect, and there was so many misunderstandings because this is for example the idea of the transubstantiation of Christ, is like does not translate well, and so what we start seeing is some of the Japanese say, are these people cannibals? Do they drink blood or what have you? And so there is a lot of tension. But what's kind of remarkable, I would say, is that particularly the Jesuits are so good at learning Japanese and the Japanese culture that they really do appeal to more of the higher ranking lords. And this is and so that's where we start seeing um, a conversion process. And it seems like the
I want
war.
to, and sorry if I interrupted you, but I want to ask as well, because in India, in early India, you see that the new settlers from Europe kind of integrate in society, and they call the white noodles in India. But do we see it kind of the same thing happening in Japan in the early Christians and early Europeans arriving to kind of settle into Japanese culture as well, and in the same way that they would do in India, as they would integrate and intermarry with Japanese and again as they did in India when they first came there.
I would say that the numbers are they're fewer number. I mean, there's a lot of exchanges. Most of these people are Catholic missionaries, so there's not a lot of intermarrying that's happening at this time. And so I'd say the numbers are so small that no, we don't see that, but we do see incredible exchanges regarding clothes, food. Like you've all heard of Japanese, tempura, right? I mean, the fried fish, or fried shrimp, you know what I mean, deep fried fish. That's from tempura quattro, what I mean, the ember days. And so you would actually see sugar comes in, potatoes come in. So there's like a culinary revolution that happens with the European, particularly the Iberian and Japanese exchanges there. In terms of clothes, the cross becomes popular. Western things, Western chests. You see this, and all these exchanges are happening, and it's not really thought of in Japan as being foreign or not. So that's what I find to be really really interesting. And you do see that some, and again, the Jesuits, because again, this is like the Reformation, the time of the Reformation, and if you think about in Europe, it's like one of the key issues is how do you determine a land is a Protestant or Christian? It's by the religion of the ruler. So that's why the Portuguese tried to always convert the ruler. And when they did, they would count the whole domain as being Christian, even though it'd be a small number of people that were in charge like that. And so we do see a number of high-ranking warriors. One was named Otomo Sorin, who changed his name to Otomo Francisco, and he put his FRCO initials on his cannon, his saddle, and everything else. And recently, I've been studying some. I'd say the most devout Christians were some young warriors who converted around the age 14, 13, 14, 15. These are the ones that tend to really be, and so I'm actually writing an article about a suit of armor that's in Leeds and it's by a certain warrior named, his name was Naito Sadahiro, but he took the name John and became Naito Joan. And actually on this suit of armor, he has the cross all over the place. He has a giant cross on his helmet, And this person fought from he converted when he was 14 in the 1560s, and he fought in a lot of campaigns. He fought in Korea. He was negotiated with the Ming, and in the end, when you start seeing the anti-Christian things, he went to Manila. And so you actually see that some of these figures would actually choose exile over that. So I would say that it varies. There's a variety of responses, but in some ways we underestimate how some of these converts were very fervent. And so that's so somehow this did translate in certain ways, but this was prohibited, and so basically when that happened, these people would either die or leave Japan.
Was a worry when the samurais converted with to Christianity, that it would have a negative impact on them as warriors? Or did they think it would be that they would be more fierce warriors because of the belief in a religion and the afterlife that they would come to when they died?
I would say it was very polarizing. So that you would see some, like I talked about this Naito Joan, he was by all accounts a very skilled warrior. I mean, he fought a long time. Everyone said he made an impression, and no one doubted his bravery. But you would also see, like for example, there's a family called the Shimazu, and they did not like the other major Christian converts, the Otomo, and they were very devout Buddhists, and so they strongly emphasized the fact that their Buddhists were stronger than the Christian gods, and the Otomo actually like once had their cannons that were abandoned in the mud. The Shimazu took them, and so on, and where the Otomo actually tried to destroy a lot of temples and shrines in one area to make it like a Christian kingdom in this small region, and that enraged their rivals so much that they actively tried to destroy them. So I would say that really it did lead to a lot of changes, And one thing that's interesting is you had this Toyotomi Hideyoshi who came in, and when he sort of gained control over this whole area, he actually sort of said, one is that you cannot give harbors to the Europeans, but then he also said that he didn't want a strong European presence, but he basically said, regardless of the belief of the Lord, the followers should not be coerced into having that same religion. So he was kind of willing to allow Christianity. He just didn't like forced conversion, and so that explains the way he's often thought to be an anti-Christian ruler. But you actually, in the wars that followed, you see a lot of the Christian lords actually supported the Hideyoshi's cause. And but his forces were defeated later by the Tokugawa, and the Tokugawa are the ones that really pushed for the anti-Christian stuff and particularly in the 1630s onward.
Was there a cleansing of Christian soldiers and samurai when the banishment of Christianity came into place?
When you start seeing the persecution of Christianity, the people were, again, this is the later regime called the Tokugawa, but everyone had to register in a temple, and they had to basically they had an image of Christ, and they all had to step on it and renounce Christianity. And if they didn't, they would be killed or exiled. And so that's why a lot of these Christian lords I mentioned, they saw it was looking bad in 1614, 15, and they just left with their whole family like that and became devout Christians, remained devout Christians in Manila society. So that's really what happened. And you do have there were sort of hidden Christian communities in the Nagasaki region for a long time, and so you still had that, but it's not clear of how much doctrinal understanding do we have a lot of this. It's not particularly clear to me, but it is clear that there were other prominent warrior families that were that would basically be very fervent believers. At the same time, the early Portuguese, when they came in, were influential in overthrowing one of the most powerful lords. And their successors, this family called the Mori, actually, even very early, felt that this Christianity was a dangerous threat. So even in the 1560s, it's kind of interesting. You have some that are fervent Christians, some that are fervently anti-Christian, and this debate goes on for about half a century before basically the anti-Christian side wins out. Um, and I think it's also because they felt that this was the spear point of conquest, and events did show that to be true, because the Spanish do gain control of the Philippines, and even Hideyoshi and his officials aware that the Spanish were talking about, well, we could invade China. You know what I mean? And so again, we forget, but they had conquered South America, they had conquered Central America, and they were moving on. They took over the Philippines, and they were actively thinking about how they could conquer these other regions. And so I think it was the geopolitical side of it which was thought to be more problematic than anything else. But the fact that certain rulers like this Ultimo Francisco would destroy temples and shrines, or that others, the Omura, would give a port to the Portuguese, and then the Portuguese, they would, and the Spanish would talk about conquest. All those things kind of lined up to where ultimately there was a turn away from Christianity. But and those that didn't like it either died or left.
So, of course, one thing we have to, and the last thing I mentioned was, of course, the introduction of gunpowder and how this would affect the samurai way of life and military life in general. Because, of
Mm-hmm.
course, we know that it takes years, it takes time to become good with the sword and fight with a sword if you want to be a skilled warrior. It takes time, but with gunpowder, and of course, even though the early gunpowder were unreliable, it's still kind of revolutionized in a way because it was easier to train someone. It didn't take as much time as it
Mm-hmm.
would training with a sword. So let's talk about how this would
Yeah,
change the
it
Japanese
changed a
society.
lot. It did. I mean, I guess I would say the key thing is that I kind of was saying that swords aren't used that much in battle to begin with, and that the armies before guns even show up are massed forces. The first guns appear actually in the 1460s through Okinawa, very primitive guns. So they're showing up there. The first guns did not quite have the impact you thought because it's not until a very good gunpowder recipe came in. And the actually we have a website at Princeton that has a translation of this, of one of these early gunpowder recipe. One thing that's really interesting is that in China, yes, the gunpowder was originated there, but the ratio of things was not of maximum explosive potential. So what it was is more like fireworks. It would pop off and but it didn't really explode. And when this recipe went to Europe, that's where the Europeans had maximized its potential. And they would also not just have it as a powder, but they would heat it up in what's called like a slurry so that, and then they dry it together and be very consistent ratio. And so we know this because there's a Japanese gunpowder recipe from the 1560s. And they said that really more than the guns, it's this recipe which really matters. And it basically takes you step through how to make a gunpowder slurry with the maximum explosive potential. So that's one thing we know that's happening. Once that comes in,
This might be a silly question, but I've got to ask anyway because in at least in video games, the favorite thing is exploding arrows. Was there attempt to try to make exploding arrows from gunpowder?
there are things called. Well, it's interesting because one of the names for guns is actually fire arrows. Okay, so yeah, I think there was something like that. Sure, but they actually would set arrows on fire and do that. So there's a lot of experimentation. And actually, what's interesting is that it wasn't obvious that the guns were significantly better than the longbows, and it took a generation for that to change. And there's several reasons for it. One is one of the key ingredients for gunpowder is potassium nitrate, and Japan did not have good stores of that at all. So it was very hard to get enough materials for the gunpowder. Japan's a very wet place. So if it's a rainy day, these guns, because you would light the fuse and all that, they had problems there. And it takes a long time to fire. And also, I think is that what I would say is that we tend to overestimate the power of these guns because they're not terribly accurate. So I would say that, like, for example, a longbow, if you have someone even with like a slight steel plate, if you're 30 feet away, you might be able to penetrate that. You could kill someone at that range. And you could fire it much longer than that to cause minor injuries, but the killing range is around 30 feet. And I would say that the guns, it doubles that. You see what I mean? But it's still not something which is overwhelmingly superior. And I know this because you see wound lists, and you actually see where people are shot by arrows and shot by bullets at the same time. And you see that through the 1560s, 70s, and 80s, the projectile wounds, because again, you have to compare. I would say compare the same function of something. So if it's an arrow, you compare it with a bullet. You see what I mean? Because it's different than a weapon for hand to hand. And there that it's a 50-50 ratio, the number of wounds by arrows to bullets. And it's not until 1600 that it's 80% bullets, 20% arrows. So it takes until 1600, over half a century, for these guns to be there, the European guns, for them to be dominant. But just one other, just real quick, what really influenced people at the time more than the guns were the European cannon. And so the cannon is a thing that they cared about way more. And the cannon led to the move towards stone fortification. And you actually will see cases where some of these ambitious lords were like, I will convert to Christianity if you give me some cannon. So I would actually say that we underestimate the importance of the cannon, because that's really what made a difference. And that's really what they wanted.
Were the improvement of gunpowder and powder and cannons part of what drove the samurai in Japan kind of to, as we see it, and this is of course many centuries later, but it's not partly why the samurai eventually would into drive away from it and be into irrelevance.
Um, well, I think that the factors are just different. Do you see what I mean? So that you have, everyone recognized the importance of cannon. Everyone recognized its military function, and probably the bigger change was once they moved people away from the land. In after 1590, you do see, over the next centuries, yeah, they're more bureaucrats than people that are training. But I still see a keen awareness of the technological changes. And even, for example, when Japan in later centuries is thought to be kind of closed off, but there was a small Dutch outpost in Japan. And one thing that's quite interesting is that they the Japanese government learned through them that you had like improvements in cannon technology, and then you have like the steel furnace, reverberatory furnace, where you can manufacture these things. And so they in 1850s they're making very, very advanced guns. So they're always up on these things. You see what I mean? And I think that's what's a really sort of interesting aspect to this country. Really, they really keep track of the technological changes, and the social order isn't driving it. It's not the social dynamic which matters. It's more the intellectual political dynamic.
Something we haven't talked about yet, but we gotta have to talk about, of course, is the famous seppuku and the suicide ritual of the samurai. And I don't think this was just as exclusive to the samurais, of course, but were the seppuku introduced, and when did they begin to say, oh, it's dishonorable to be caught in battles? It's better to commit seppuku instead of being caught in battle.
So there's a lot to unpack there. So basically, you do see cases where if someone's fighting a rebellion, that they was thought that if they would be captured, that they would be beheaded, and that was thought to be a dishonorable thing. But you don't see this idea of seppuku, or I think they use the word harakiri. In phonetic documents, they called it harakiri at the time. More often than not, belly slitting or whatever. I'd say that probably the earliest evidence you see people doing that is probably more 14th century. But it was an extreme act where one would, and I think that where it becomes far more common, it's due to another thing which is going on here. And that I'll tell you, for example, in one case, Minamoto Yoritomo is the founder of the first shogunate in the 1180s, very powerful figure, and he was upset with a person, so he had him executed. And after he had him executed, the family of that person killed the execution. And so what's really interesting is there's this idea that if someone kills someone, there has to be a balancing of bodies. So the state doesn't, in barbarian terms, monopolize coercive force in this time. So what happens is this is where, so when does seppuku become this big thing? It becomes this big thing. I'd say it's like around Hideyoshi and this later time, where you don't want to have an executioner because of these early problems. So you force someone to be their own executioner. You see what I mean? That's what seppuku is. To say, if you commit seppuku, you will, your lands will remain, your estate will remain, and it will thought to be an honorable death. You will not have it's not a criminal punishment. And so that's really where you see that that's happening, if that makes sense. It's part of that later legal world in a lot of ways, and that's where we see this.
So, and this, another thing, of course, the next thing I want to talk about is how Japan would close itself off from society, and until, of course, until the American forcing Japan to open up again to international trade and commerce. So let's talk a
Mhm.
little bit about the period of Japan closing itself and how again this would how samurai's culture would be affected by the closing off of the rest of the world.
So, so just to let you know, like what the process is that really in the over the course of the early 17th century, there's a new the third great shogunate is the Tokugawa regime, and they've particularly after the 1630s they start clamping down on movement, and after a major uprising, they basically prohibit Christianity. They do not allow people to leave the country, but they still do allow trade, and but the trade they want to monopolize it. I believe they're influenced by mercantilist attitude. They want to have like a favorable balance of trade. They want to control this trade. And there's like the harbor of Nagasaki is that's where they have their Dutch, their Chinese merchants, and so on. And so it's called closed off. And so if you look at the movement of people, yes, it is. Those Japanese that are in the Philippines or in Thailand, they cannot come back. You see what I mean? But in terms of dissemination of ideas and stuff, you see, there's still a lot that's happening. And this is again where the high point of where you have the Tokugawas, where you have the creation of these giant urban centers, the creation of the samurai order. That's where the samurai then live in the urban thing. And a lot of we think about traditional Japan with rice and all that really comes in at this time. And so then I think that also what's interesting is the Dutch are a conduit for a lot of knowledge, and so then you have a lot of these officials that study Dutch, and they learn a lot about the world, and so that's why I talked about before that this can be about medical knowledge. This can also be about metallurgy, and that's why I thought one of the most remarkable things is certain things like um, blasting furnaces and creating the new weapons. They learned how to manufacture this while they're still closed off. You see what I mean? And so that's one thing that I think with the when Japan in the 1850s opened up, a lot of the Europeans, like the British and all that, thought that they saw these new cannons coming in, and they thought, oh, the Russians must have given them that, and it turns out they had been manufactured domestically by the Japanese, because they had these reverberatory furnaces. Their problem was they didn't have enough gunpowder. They didn't have a lot of shells, but they could manufacture cannon that the best were very close to European examples, and sometimes they even shot and killed one of the British admirals. So that's something I find that's really interesting. So it's kind of it depends on what you look at whether you see it as close. But in terms of trade and knowledge, I'd say it's not really.
So it wasn't a total isolation in that sense.
It wasn't. It wasn't. I would say that it just more there was no emigration or immigration. That was very that did not happen. But and it was managed trade. It was less trade than before, and the attitudes toward trade were I still think more concerned about like a favorable balance as opposed to before they would just trade everything. So yes, at certain level, and you could not be a Christian. So there are certain restrictions. You know what I mean? But I wouldn't say it's completely closed off from the world, not at all. And then the moment that these people had a chance, they would buy these new guns, and they're very attuned to military innovations at all times.
Let's talk about the Americans forcing the Japanese to open up again their borders and how, and of course, again, I want to end at the Meiji Restoration as well.
Hmm.
Because this happened almost simultaneously as I think it also happened very close to when the Americans opened up that the Meijis would rise to power.
Well, so I think what happened, Commodore Perry, a lot of countries were trying to pressure the Japan to engage in trading rights and all that, and they met with the Russians, the English, very success. They didn't meet with success for a lot of missions. The Americans under Perry got lucky because they took their fleet. And then one thing is with the rise of coal ships and all that, they have a greater range. And America just happened to go to Edo Harbor, and blocked off the supply of food to the harbor because it was all shipped. And so that pressured the Tokugawa basically to allow exchanges to happen and to open up. And it was more like you'd have a consulate, you'd have these people, and what they also did was they stopped the restriction of Japanese from going abroad. So this is 1850s. As soon as that happens, what a lot of these powerful lords, particularly the ones that never moved, that didn't like the Tokugawa, they immediately go to China. They immediately buy up the most recent guns and cannons, and then they come back. You see what I mean? And so that's kind of then. So it's interesting is that the Tokugawa were never really popular, but they're keeping these lords under control. It worked for 2.5 centuries, but the moment that gets out, that's where you see this change. And also the Tokugawa, they were a shogun, a general, but again, this is a position which was delegated by the court. So when the Tokugawa were dominant, they kept where no one could have access to the court except themselves. So the moment they loosen up, all these other figures go to the court. Then they use the court to justify destroying the Tokugawa, if that makes sense. You see what I mean? And they have the new weapons, and that's really then what happens. I'm oversimplifying because the Tokugawa gave up quickly, but then different warlords are fighting among each other, and this the ones that are fighting aren't always reactionary, what have you. And so that's really what happens, and that's where, in the end, you have a Meiji state that's still dominated by the court, by the emperor, and that's what's restored the shogunate ends. And then, but even beyond that, you see a number of military encounters. It's the degree of centralization or not. And I don't know if we want to. I could talk about, like, there's the famous last uprising in the 1870s, and that one, there's the famous Tom Cruise film and all that. And the irony is that that's it's in the realm of the Shimazu of the South, very powerful. And these were Meiji officials that wanted to have a much more sort of more control over Korea. When they lost this policy thing, they decided to engage in an uprising. So they go down and they take over the government armories, and they actually took where they had the best cannon and everything else, and that's where they started this uprising. And it failed because they could not get enough support, and ironically, they did not have enough ammunition, and so they ran out of bullets, they ran out of gunpowder, and that's where, in the end, this idea of these people fighting with their swords because they didn't have enough ammunition to begin with. So that's the last of these kind of uprisings.
So let's talk about the end of the samurai and how the last samurais came out of existence. Because as far as I understand it, they were kind of unemployed people at the end of the samurai's existence. And was it kind of at the time a good riddance? Was it an ancient order that was just kind of waiting to die at this point in 1868?
Well, it was a few years later. So what happened is that they were all granted a stipend, and it was so much money for the government budget that it couldn't afford it. And so one thing is that the new government is like, look, everyone is part of the state. It's actually going back to the very early model. Everyone's equal here. And so these orders don't mean anything. So what they would do is they converted the stipends to bonds. And so most of the samurai did not, their stipend was not enough to be very valuable, but those that were the old lords, or the high ranking ones, they gained a lot of money, and then they became reconstituted as an aristocracy with the old court nobility, and they became like, then they had enough money to be like capital investors and all this other stuff. So the higher end became a new aristocracy, which was thought to be, Japan was looking to Europe and say, well, what do all the successful states have? Oh, they have an aristocracy. We need to have that. And it was a fusion of the upper end of this warrior order with the old courtiers. But more often than not, it was thought to be an old custom. The idea of the swords were thought to be worthless, and it changed because one of the hallmarks of the Meiji period was this idea that evil customs of the past should be abolished, and Japan should follow the new ways of the world. And that was dress, clothes, hairstyles. There was this sort of debate about everything, and at that time it was thought that the samurai thing was just an old custom that didn't mean anything.
Let's talk about how the samurais are viewed in history, in especially in modern Japan today, and in general in the world today, because and it's my understanding, especially after World War II, the it was not a very popular topic, especially in Japan. Is elite that
Right.
samurais were, but it seems to be growing more now. Of course, in the 21st century, the popularity of samurais. We see this in anime. We see this in games like the Ghost of Tsushima, as I mentioned earlier. So
Mhm.
let's talk a little bit about how samurais are, and of course you have the Last Samurai, the famous movie as well. So let's talk a little bit about
Yes.
how popular media and how both in Japan and worldwide how samurais are viewed as this historical group, and how this how people kind of feel how they are represented by popular media.
Well, I mean, it took after, I mean, there was kind of like, a hiatus, like, but after the samurai order was abolished, it was it was not very popular at all. It was thought to be something of feudal of the past. 1920s, 30s, there was kind of this new movement talking about the importance of the spirit. The Japanese army, which had European style sabers, goes back to encouraging the samurai sword. This is kind of that moment, you see this glorification that
Also,
died
I'm going
before.
to say, I'm sorry for interrupting you. I forgot to mention this, but I want to say as well that the Seppuku drug, like you said, it has different name in the Second World War. It seems that kind of followed, especially in the Second World War, when Japanese will not surrender, that they will commit suicide rather than being tortured. That seemed to be following in the Japanese military as well. That's one thing that we seem to be
Yeah,
followed.
that's like that becomes this idea of never surrendering and all this other, that's, I'd say it's like a 1920s moment where the 1920s, the army, a lot of its ideals are shifted, and you see this glorification of all these things, and this idea that, the samurai never surrenders and all this stuff. So that's where you see this stuff is all coming back. You see what I mean? And I'd say but it's completely discredited after 45. And so, yeah, I would even say, like, when I started studying this topic in the 90s, um and I actually got a lot of resistance in Japan and elsewhere. It was like, why are you studying this? You know what I mean? Well, who cares about wars, or why do you do that? And so, or this idea that the warriors are kind of like a mafia thing. You know what I mean? And so that's kind of, so there's a lot of negative stuff, I'd say, until the 21st century, when I don't know. It's almost like a younger generation sees it's almost like a reverse exoticism. It's like,
Of course, one of the more popular animes you have is
yeah,
Naruto, for
right.
example.
So that's why I say the 21st century, now you sort of see this is like thought to be a important cultural trope, and now it's become this positive thing that's linked to Japanese identity, and it really has shifted, I would say, with the passing of basically everyone who experienced World War II. You see what I mean? And so I
Yeah.
think it's when that generation died, then it's, enough time has passed that people can look back at these things, but there's still not a whole lot of understanding of how it changes over time. So I would say that I've talked about the Tokugawa period, like from 1600 onward. That's most people's understanding of what is traditional Japan. And if you go back to the earlier times when they're fighting, I think it's such a foreign world to many of the Japanese people that it tends to be very anachronistic how they display things. They don't realize, like, again, that people would fight for both sides. They demand compensation. If they're not given enough compensation, they'd fight for the other one, but it wasn't disloyal. It was all business, as it were. And this later on, these ideas of loyalty, or that they're all fighting with the swords, all that stuff is just kind of made up, but it looks good and it's exciting. And even stuff like Star Wars, I mean, we know George Lucas with Darth Vader was influenced by the samurai helmet and the samurai sword. And so that, I actually think that the Star Wars lightsaber is something that actually, had an effect in Japan. They see that it's like, oh, it's like our swords. I actually believe that influence things tremendously. And it's just based on this, it's like the idealization of the warriors has a life of its own, irrespective of how they actually existed. And I think in some ways that's more durable and influential than the historical reality of what had happened.
Thank you so much for coming. I think we've done around it up there. Do you have it before you go? Do you have anything you want to promote social media where people might find you if they have further questions about the samurais or any books you want to share with us today before you go, or
Oh,
links in the
sure. I mean,
description?
so yeah, if people just want to, it's Tom Conlan of Princeton. If you look on the Princeton website, you should be able to find me in my websites and on academia. I have a lot of my articles there. I mean, I will say, if someone's interested in this, I do have a book, a book about the samurai that came in, but recently this is it's called Samurai and the Warrior Culture of Japan, and it's a source reader. So a lot of these actual sources, if you want to read the primary sources that came out about explaining like it's narratives of the accounts of these warriors, the
Fascinating.
documents, their letters, I'd say people might want to look at that.
Thank
So,
you so much for coming. It's been a great pleasure to have you on. This has been Without Age 12. You can find us on social media on the Twitter, Instagram, Blue Sky. We're under Without Age 12. We are available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you can find podcasts these days. If you enjoyed this episode, give us 5 stars on Spotify, or you can give us 1 if you hate this podcast. But 5 would be preferable, or you can, of course, write a review on Apple Podcasts. If you are on YouTube, like, share, and subscribe and check out some other episodes. We definitely have something that you might enjoy. And with awesome guests, we have awesome episodes coming out. So I think 2025 will be a really good year for this podcast. And 2024 has been amazing for this podcast as well. So check out some. We do monthly live streams on YouTube. So check us out there as well. My name is Alan. This has been Not Aged Well. Like, share, and subscribe. I'll see you next time.